Hello, good afternoon, or good morning to some of y'all. Thanks for joining us. We're together again. These weeks really fly by, huh? It's me, it's Allison. You may not recognize my voice. It's a little deeper today. I'm sad to say I'm battling a bit of a tail end of a cold, but nothing would keep me away from this learning collaborative, friends. Don't you worry. So apologies if I have to pause for a cough or a sip of tea. But I'm happy to be here with you for our exciting webinar, and I know what a lot of you have been waiting for, which is our deep dive into HR metrics. Have to do the initial announcements, of course, which is just to remind you that we're recording. I don't have any polls today, so we're hoping that if you have questions or things to share, even if it's just like a, hey, yeah, we do that, that you'll go ahead and put it in the chat questions box. And of course, if you want to say, hey, this is a great time, I'm having fun, we hope that you are having fun and that you'll put anything you want to share in the chat box. If you have any problems, you can reach out to my other faculty member, Mariah, either through the chat or for her email if something goes terribly wrong and you get kicked off the webinar. I know we had a bit of a glitch last week, and I appreciate all of y'all's patience and sticking with us through that. So hang on, we're in for a wild ride today, and look forward to your questions and comments in the chat and the discussion. We are talking today about human resources data. Yes, this can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I will just say that I like to talk about them as anything, human resources data are basically any metrics that help you understand what we might consider traditional issues at your organization. So there's going to be some things that are telling you a little bit about the kind of practice experience, which is stuff like, you know, how many patients are or that kind of thing. Then there's this kind of stuff, which is basically what's going on with the workforce that you do have. So the type of data that we're talking about today, there is no hard and fast rule. If you want to throw something else in there, feel free. And again, we're going to get to other types of data and more specificity in future. Today, we're going to look at some specific HR metrics, what they mean, collect them, and of course, the all-important reason of why. Why are you collecting it to begin with? My goal is not to make your lives harder. It's just to help you do what you're doing already a little bit better and with some data backup. So, of course, we're going to urge you to check your systems, and I know we had some great sharing on the discussion board about what systems you are using. I think it might help you, some buddies in that endeavor. So please, number one, go to the discussion board and share what systems you're using. If you do have an official kind of HR system or staffing system, even if all you have at your fingertips system, whatever you or a member of your team would be able to get. Now, I mention these here because the great news is that most of your systems are going to provide a lot of this data for you. So this is not something you're necessarily going to have to clean or go find yourself or build in an Excel file or whatever. Although I'll that to you next week in the assignment section. A lot of your systems are going to have something, and if your systems have something, we really recommend that you start there. The metrics and the specific way we're looking at them is the way that we would recommend and that we have some experience in, but there's going to be a lot that you have sort of easily available. So consider your own reports from your own systems a great starting place. There's no real wrong way. The issue, of course, is always going to be to tie it to your goals with looking at that data. So check there, and we'll get back to that being sort of your week's assignment, which is go to your systems and see. But first, through this half hour, 30 minutes, we want to talk about kind of what's the deal with HR metrics. I wanted to say that it's really, fortunately, we're going to be all using different routes to get to similar but not the same destination. There is no sacred, holy, grand location of data, mecca that will say, yep, you did it, you calculated the data the right way, and here's exactly how you use it. The issue is really in the details, right? So the name of the metric may be the same. We may all say, oh yes, we're collecting turnover data. but the things that we're putting into that turnover data are going to be a little bit different. And they should be different based on what the goal is for using them. If Sally is collecting turnover data in order to identify which site is giving her the most problems, and John is collecting turnover data in order to find out which managers are maybe causing the most turnover, they may have different kinds of inputs and use the data differently. So we're all going to be kind of on this journey together, but just know we're not necessarily driving to the same place as we go. That's okay. There's still a lot we can learn from each other about, again, how we're collecting in. And really the analysis part is the important thing. Doing something with the data that we're talking about is the most important thing. So we're going to start here. Time to fill. I love this one. I'm from a recruiting background, if y'all don't remember. And so this one's a really great one to have around. And I want to just talk about, we're going to talk about the basics. We're going to talk about why we're going to talk about the types of details they could use, and we're going to talk about really some inputs that they should be considering. This is a great one to start with too, because it really can have a lot of variation in terms of what those inputs are, which I hope will illustrate to you that you may have in your data between another health center. To fill, what is it? That's basically the length of time that a job is open. That means it's available and it is unfilled. So how long does it take when you have an open job to fill that job? That's all it is. A lot of these calculations are actually extremely simple, right? So all you're trying to track is how long it takes you to fill an open position. The issue, of course, is why are you asking that question? So we hope, if you're interested in this, you sit down with your team and you think, kind of, what are our goals for any of this, right? So course have had different goals, and then it changes what they're doing with it. Maybe you're saying, hey, how do we want to make a staffing plan to minimize vacancies? Let's say you know somebody's going to leave and you know it takes this amount of time to recruit somebody. How are you going to actually be organizing people on your team to minimize that damage? Maybe you want to say, hey, we've got some recruitment resources, but how do we allocate those based on the staffing plan that we have, knowing that it takes this long to recruit all these different types of disciplines? For providers especially, we've had some health centers say, wait, how long can we expect to have lost revenues in that position? Meaning they're not necessarily going to do anything. They don't have a problem right at that second. But let's say a dentist walks in the door and says, hey, here's my official notice. As of this date, I'm done here. Okay, well, what does that mean for your health center? If you start recruiting the next day, how long is going to take you to fill that dental position? And then from there, the difference between how long it's going to take you to fill and when that person actually stops patients, what's the impact on your revenue? That can be a great thing to just know. You don't actually have to do anything actionable with that. An example of how a goal can help you be prepared in future. But it's a great one to have. Is thinking about how you're planning your staffing time. So I know we have a lot of you HR professionals for which this is going to, these types of things are your responsibility, recruitment, retention of providers and other types of staff. So figuring out how are you really going to plan your workload if something like that happens, or maybe you're going to open a new site and you know you're going to have to recruit all different types of positions. How long is that going to really take you? What kind of increased strain of time, resources, etc. do you need to plan for? How much help are you going to need? All of these are great goals. And depending on your goal, you might want to have lots of detail on your time to fill. So we talked originally about time to fill is how long is a job open and available. And so if you're just thinking about, okay, between when it's open and it's closed, that's great. But again, depending on what your specific goal, you can also do all these different things. You can look at how long it takes you to get a certain number of acceptable candidates. So depending on how you stage out your recruitment, for example, maybe it takes you 3 months if you're looking for a dental hygienist to find all the candidates that you're going to need to fill that job. You want to check how long it takes you to complete interviews for types of positions. How about how long it takes you to complete background checks and do credentialing how many number of offers you give out that get accepted over a certain period of time. How long after a candidate signs a contract that they actually start working. All these things are great. I don't think all of you should have all of this detail. The idea is you figure out why would you want to look at this data, and then figure out which element and which level of detail is appropriate for that goal. A lot of the excitement for time to fill comes in what specific inputs and really the definitions for the inputs that you're calculating. Us, good time to fill data point has a defined reporting period. So longer is better usually for this type of thing. Some people say, what was our time to fill in the calendar year of 2017? That can be a little weird to me because a lot of times jobs take over the next year. And again, depending on what your goal is, you actually want to know over the last maybe 5 years, what's the average time to fill for all of our medical assistants? Something like that. So again, it's tied to your goal, what your definition is of your reporting period. Site and discipline are pretty obvious. Which site is it for? What type of position or what discipline of staff is that person? Trick here is too with the definition of open date and fill date. So open date seems obvious. When is the position open? But that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Is it when you start, when somebody internally says, yes, we're going to recruit for this, and all of your HR team gets up and going and starts building job descriptions and posting stuff? Is it the day that you first start externally advertising for that position? When is that open date start? And again, you should pick the definition on what you're looking at for. It does you no good if you're looking to understand, train on your internal staff. If you put open date as when you start externally recruiting, right? Because then you're missing all the action. So figure out why you're trying to collect it and then figure out the right definition for open. Fill date is also pretty contentious. I know a lot of health centers that capture fill date as when a contract is signed, which could be fine because maybe you are tracking the strain on your HR team and they're done once that contract is signed. But we know that's not really true anyway because then they have to work with onboarding and all that stuff. But contracting, if you just go by date of contract, it doesn't really tell you anything then if you're looking at lost revenues, if you're looking at strain on the other team members, if you're looking at a lot of things. So what's open date and fill date, and are you picking those definitions based on what your larger goal is? The other thing we'd add here is type of candidate, and for that I mean, are they internal or external? So were you able to promote somebody from within, find somebody internally to your organization to add, and does that impact anything in terms of your time to fill? And this could be another goal, right? Which is if we invest in leadership development, what do we think the return on investment is if that cuts our time to fill blank? So time to fill, very exciting. I love this one, and you can see there's a lot of variation in it. I encourage you, if you're interested in this one, to think, why are you interested in this? And be as specific as possible. Because that specificity is going to help you make it something that you can actually use and look at instead of just one more thing that you collect. So we're moving on. Time's wasted. Turnover. This is probably the one that we get the most questions about here at the STAR Center. And really is oftentimes people say, like, what's a good turnover rate and what should I know? So for us, the calculation of turnover is relatively simple. It's over a period of time, that's the tricky bit, divided by the average number of total positions in that same period of time. Very simple calculation, but of course you're going to add your own spin on it depending on what the goal is. A lot of different goals you could have. I mentioned earlier, you might want to know where are the specific problems. Maybe there's a site you're concerned about or teams, or you just want to know kind of where's the most turnover and what might we need to address. Maybe you're thinking about what types of disciplines might benefit from more focused retention strategies. And oftentimes we find the retention strategies are different depending on the discipline. And And so maybe you're saying, hey, we're interested in doing some of that leadership development, but we're not sure really where turnover is or what types of leadership development might be relevant to what types of people, any of that. So maybe you're trying to just understand who you have the hardest time keeping and then trying to figure out how you want to respond to that. Several of you may want to know how you incorporate turnover into your financial planning. So if you know turnover costs you this amount of money, and you know you can expect about this much turnover every year based on your performance of the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, how do you plan for that? And then also, and this is kind of a tricky bit, but something you should be considering with your staffing plan is what positions should you tentatively recruit for in the near future? Of course, nobody wants to lose anybody, and having a long tenure rate is our goal. We also have to be realistic. So if you look at the last 7 years of turnover data and you see you're really losing 4 MAs a year, or you're losing 2 physicians a year, or whatever it is, you have to really accept the reality of that and plan as best you can for that in whatever way that means for you. So maybe it's going ahead and dusting off some old job descriptions and getting those prepared. Maybe it's intervening and having conversations with people that you think might be at risk of leaving and figuring out how you get them to stay. All of those things are possible. The point is, you should have a very specific goal for why you want to look at turnover. And it can't just be, well, we want to know. It's got to be something about, well, how are you going to use it? And making that plan of action before you even look at these numbers is going to, I think, be really helpful for you. Once you figure out what that goal is, there's lots of levels of detail that you can include here. The handouts for this are available, actually, by the way, in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll put them online so you can go through these detail options in detail later. But maybe you want to look at something like how much it costs you by site when there's turnover. Maybe you really want to examine the reasons for voluntary turnover. You can come up with some kind of a retention strategy. Maybe you want to really look at managers and say, okay, who's doing a great job? Any of that's possible, and all this plus more. But again, it's all tied to your goal. So we've got some key inputs here. You're going to start to see some repetition in things like reporting period, site, discipline. We think it's great if you can capture all of this by line, so you can cut it by these things. Reporting period, again, I've heard a lot of different ways that health centers do it. I would say best practices is over the last 1 year period, what your turnover rate is. You would also want to do kind of averages over a longer period of time. So 5 or 10 years, for example. Again, you might want a more immediate average that you spend more time on depending on what your goal is versus understanding average turnover and larger trends. Site and discipline are the same. Manager, I love this one. This is something that's likely not built into your HR system, but it really depends on your system. But it's basically understanding, okay, which people are turning over under which managers. And we do think like a great long-term strategy for retention is putting managers in charge of it. And if you're able to cut this data, and it is one of your goals, then this is a great way to empower managers to sort of be in charge of what they're doing. Positions and FTE you want to keep track of, and separation date. So I also know that some people put this as the last day of work. Some people put it as when they say that they're leaving because that's time to fill later. We think it should be their last day of work, but really you can do what you want depending on your goals there. And of course, voluntary and involuntary, and really reasons for leaving tied to voluntary or involuntary is really important. So if you can say relocation, voluntary, another job opportunity, whatever you want to code it as, but really being able to dig through that stuff. Great. Okay, we're moving on to tenure, which is the flip side of the coin from turnover. This one's a tricky one because I think, honestly, in a lot of people's hearts and minds, they think tenure should be forever. Everybody who works should really care about our mission and be here forever. And if they leave at any point, it's a failure on our part and a failure on theirs. Y'all doesn't have to be so dramatic. Sometimes people just get other opportunities. It's important that you have a realistic understanding of the tenure of your employees and also a realistic goal for tenure. I really, really encourage you to actually sit with your team and make sure people are on the same page. It's not a failure if a provider leaves after 7 years. You might consider that a success, especially given current rates of tenure in general. So start there. What are your goals? But also tenure itself is, again, a very simple calculation, the sum of months worked by employees divided by the average number of total employees. You have lots of potential goals with this one. Maybe, and I like this one because a lot of the goals are really, they can be quite positive. You know, what are our success stories? How do we learn from them? So maybe you want to do a deep dive of this data because next year your CMO wants to go on a story banking journey where he talks to the longest tenured employees about why they stayed and what they can improve and whatever. I don't know, that could be a thing, but maybe you want to do that with your tenure. So it could be a very positive thing. Maybe you want to see which sites have the highest tenure and maybe you want to plan. Depending on what you might expect for tenure, what are your expectations or plans for recruitment? And I like this last one because it's really a good test of your retention strategies, which is, can we use tenure before a retention strategy that we tried and after a retention strategy that we tried to prove that that strategy worked? There's, again, lots of detail available. I gave you some specifics here, but there's more opportunities, of course. Average length of tenure by site, maybe it's a return on investment for the specific strategies I mentioned. Maybe it's the positive impact of tenure on. You could do some calculations for every 6 months that this type of person stays. This is how much, you know, we save or whatever. The inputs here, you're going to see very familiar: reporting period, site, discipline, manager. I encourage you to see if it's at all possible to get that manager in there. And then start date, separation date. Again, we talked about those can mean different things to different people. Just make sure your team is on the same page. And you want to make sure, for example, start date could be the same as your fill date in your time to fill ratio. But if fill date means a contract was signed and start date in tenure means this is when they first turned up, these are different things. It's nice if you can reconcile them because then you can use consistency across your metrics. So I also want to say that lots of people calculate tenure for their current employees, especially if they're hunting for success stories, but you can also calculate it long term. So this is when you would go for like a 10-year history, 15-year history, 20-year history, however long you want. And say at our organization, people tend to stay this long. Providers especially have tended to stay this long, and you can use averages across those years. And that can be really interesting when you're thinking about recruiting people and talking with them about why they're staying and retention, because you can kind of give a profile of who your employees are and also communicate internally with leadership and sort of externally with funders and others about, you know, why you're so strong and what's appealing about your organization. Absence. Excuse me, I wanted to mention, this one's a little bit interesting. This can be the hardest one for health centers to dig up depending on how their systems are, and a lot depending on how, like, their paid time off, is it sick or excused or unexcused or whatever. But we think in general, if you can keep track of kind of what we'll call unexcused absences, meaning unplanned absences, and you divide that by the number of total work days, you can kind of get a sense of absenteeism and, of course, its impact on the bottom line. And so, again, this is kind of a messier one. So I don't want you to spend too much time on it if it seems from your HR systems that it's going to be a big problem. But we think it has some potentially really interesting goals. You know, you might really want to understand these are really present-based goals, which are a lot of where really are their problems. Maybe you implemented a new system or process or EHR issue or whatever, and all of a sudden you're seeing people are absent a lot more, they don't want to come into work, whatever, right? Feedback on that. You also really want to understand, for example, maybe how much productivity are you losing to absenteeism? If people are gone, how do you incorporate that into the bottom line? There's fewer things you might want to do here, and we kept it few just because we've heard from health centers that do use this. They all use it differently. But crude absence rate is something interesting. The cost resulting from absenteeism, very interesting. And percentage of sick versus other leave being used, but that's only if you're working in an organization that has those kind of separated out. More of the same inputs here: reporting period, site, discipline, manager. The details in that input piece: number of absences and types of absences, which are kinds of like, again, depending on your system, was it reported late? Was it planned? Was it unplanned? Was it unexcused? Whatever your system is, just understanding how many they were, what types they were, and of course the hourly rate for that person, which will help you really understand the financial impact of that. And there's lots of free calculators online for this one too, if you want to get into the cost of this type of data metric. Last one, which I'm going to touch on just very briefly because it's really focused a lot on providers, although of course you can use it for other types of staff, which is really how much revenue does each staff generate per visit. Of course, you want to use this to understand the financial impact of things like turnover, what's your return on investment potentially in investing in recruitment. So if turnover costs you a certain amount because the lost employee revenue, let's say for every day that this type of employee is missing, you're losing this much money. How much might it be worth then instead to invest in retention to keep that person around? You also, of course, could say, just how can we expect our finances to be impacted by vacancies? And that's the kind of thing we talked about earlier in relation to turnover. And an example of how a turnover metric, maybe you have the same goal for turnover as you do for revenue, your revenue metric, and you want to look at those things simultaneously for the same goal, which is understanding how your finances would be impacted by specific vacancies. You can look at team composition for this one. You can look at certain financial planning. You can look at maybe discipline priorities, which types of people, for example, you want to hire. Mental health is a great example because we've heard from some folks that, for example, psychologists get reimbursed much more than licensed professional counselors. So depending on what that revenue is for each type of employee, you might say, let's hire this type of behavioral over this type of behavioral health professional. All interesting stuff. Again, no wrong answers. It's just really what's your goal here. This one's a little bit more simple. Reporting period and site, and then you want to look at that revenue per employee type. So looking at all your dentists and all your dental hygienists, and then all your nurse practitioners, and then the number of visits per employee will also play into it. This is exactly the kind of thing that's also great for cross-team conversation between, let's say, you and your CMO and your CFO to say, okay, what are we really talking about when we're building the teams, and how is this impacting all of us in terms of the financial health of our organization? There's lots of other key metrics that I'm sure you're using. I think Zaire shared last time his staffing ratios, and actually he put this very fantastic thing on the discussion board, which I hope you'll check out. There's also other things that you may look at, and we encourage you to: cost of benefits, cost per hire, job satisfaction, maybe training expenses per employee, any of that kind of stuff. These are all great. But if you're starting from nothing, or you're thinking, I have some things, maybe you have some of these and you want to really embed them into your workforce plans, go back, revisit the slides, and then think about what of the 5 that I mentioned you might want to cover. The important thing is that you don't collect it just to have it. There's no reason to make more work for anybody just so everybody can say, yep, we have data metrics, just look at us, right? It's what do you want to use it for? And what's it actually going to be relevant to, and how is any of it going to actually help you get to improved results, which is just a more stable workforce, and one that you don't have to constantly be recruiting for, right? So I hope that you did the homework assignment from last week, which was to pick some of those goals. I didn't see a lot of people posting on the discussion board what their specific goals were, which is okay. You do not have to share. But go back to your workforce plans, or whatever. If you don't have a workforce plan, if there's something, a workforce plan you'd like to have that would include in a certain element, and think, okay, which HR metrics would actually help us in this element? And so that's what your assignment is until we talk next week for your actual assignment and our chat time. Figure out what data your current system offers, just what is available to you at all. Just get to know that. And then if there's any things that pop out immediately at you that you think, I like this, I'd like to find a way to incorporate it into my workforce plans, that's great. Bring that to next week's discussion and we will workshop that together. And then also if you say, well, I have this one part of the workforce plan, I have no idea which metric it should go with, that's great. Bring that to next week's session and we'll go over it together. And then of course, lastly, if you say, yep, I have stuff, here's how I'm using it, let's just talk through together how I could actually be putting this into practice more, or what my next steps are. I know what the problem is, I want to talk strategies. So all those things are great. I really hope you'll bring things to next week's time so that we can, workshop things together, talk through problems. We're going to make the recording available to you and the slides available to you on the discussion board. Please keep posting there and putting your questions, etc. And I will look forward to talking with you more next week. Thanks, everybody.